Hello. Lately, Amanda had been different. She was always on her phone, her screen tilted away from me. Late nights at the boutique, which she insisted were necessary to keep the business running, had grown more frequent. She had taken to buying clothes I'd never seen her wear, and her perfume, something subtle and floral she used to save for special occasions, had become an everyday staple. The changes were subtle at first, like shadows creeping along the edges of a wall. But once you notice, it is impossible to unsee. It was a Thursday evening when the first tangible sign presented itself. I came home from the site a little earlier than usual, hoping to surprise her. The house was quiet, too quiet, and when I called her name, there was no response. She was likely at the boutique, I figured, but something compelled me to look around. On the kitchen counter sat her handbag, half-zipped. It was a small, red leather bag I'd bought her for her birthday last year. Normally, I would never snoop, but the unease gnawing at the back of my mind compelled me to unzip it further. Inside, tucked alongside her wallet and keys, was a receipt. Dinner for two. Steakhouse. A bottle of Merlot. The date printed in sharp black ink caught my eye last Friday. I was out of town for a project that weekend, returning late Sunday. Amanda had said she was at the boutique late that night, catching up on inventory. The words she'd spoken replayed in my head, now hollow and brittle. I was so busy I barely had time to eat. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. The receipt could have been anything, a business dinner, maybe, but the pit in my stomach knew better. Later that night, Amanda came home. She was wearing a sleek black dress, the kind she reserved for networking events, her makeup immaculate. Long day? I asked casually, leaning against the armrest of the couch. She nodded, flashing me a tired smile. Exhausting. I'm thinking of cutting hours for the staff. We've been slow, and it doesn't make sense to keep them late. Her voice was calm, even confident. She dropped her handbag onto the table and began slipping out of her heels. I didn't press. I just watched, nodding occasionally. How's business overall? Up and down, she said lightly, tossing a glance over her shoulder. Why do you ask? No reason. Just making conversation. The cracks became harder to ignore in the days that followed. There were more dinners out, more late nights at the boutique. She had started spending extra time in front of the mirror before leaving the house. A small voice in my head whispered that I was being paranoid, but another, louder voice countered that things didn't add up. Then came the night when everything shifted. It was just past midnight, and Amanda was fast asleep beside me. The room was dark save for the soft glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the curtains. I had been tossing and turning for hours, my mind replaying the oddities of the past few weeks. That was when she murmured his name. Trevor, she whispered, her voice soft and dreamy. I froze, my chest tightening as though someone had wrapped a fist around my ribs. She shifted slightly, her head sinking deeper into the pillow. Trevor. I didn't know a Trevor. Not personally, at least, but I'd heard the name mentioned in passing. One of her clients, a real estate developer she'd said was buying furniture and decor for his latest project. I had brushed it off at the time, thinking nothing of it. Now the name echoed in my head, heavy and sharp. I stared at the ceiling for the rest of the night, replaying the last few weeks, piecing together a timeline I didn't want to believe. The dinner receipt, the late nights, the new dresses, Trevor's name. The morning after Amanda whispered Trevor's name, I was running on little sleep and even less patience. My mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, theories, and anger. By the time I arrived at the construction site, I had made up my mind. I couldn't let this gnaw at me anymore. I needed answers, not assumptions. Mark was already there when I arrived, leaning against the side of his truck with a cup of coffee. Mark was the kind of friend who didn't pry, but always seemed to know when something was off. You look like hell, he said, straightening up as I approached. Feel like it too, I replied, trying to sound casual. Mark raised an eyebrow, waiting for more. It's Amanda, I admitted after a moment. He didn't say anything right away, just took a sip of his coffee and nodded for me to continue. She's been acting different. Late nights, weird excuses. I found a receipt for a dinner she never mentioned. And then last night, I stopped short, debating whether to tell him about Trevor's name. And then, Mark prompted. I shook my head. Just little things that don't add up. Mark let out a low whistle. That's a lot of little things. You think she's? I don't know, I said quickly. But I need to find out. Mark studied me for a moment, then nodded. What's your plan? I'm hiring someone, I said, the decision solidifying as I spoke the words. A private investigator. That evening, I met Jessica. Jessica was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. She came highly recommended through a friend of Mark's. I'll be honest with you, Samuel, she said as we sat across from each other in a small cafe near her office. I've seen this 100 times. If you're here, you probably already know what's going on. My job is to confirm it. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Tell me everything you know about your wife's habits, Jessica continued. Where she goes, who she meets, what's changed recently. I recounted everything. The late nights, the new clothes, the dinner receipt, and finally, Trevor's name. Jessica took notes, her pen moving quickly across a small notepad. And what do you want out of this? She asked when I finished. Proof, I said firmly. I don't want to accuse her of anything without evidence. Jessica nodded, tucking her notepad into her bag. I'll start tomorrow. I'll keep you updated. The first update came 3 days later. Jessica called me in the middle of the day, her tone brisk. We need to meet, she said. I have something you'll want to see. I left the site early, telling Mark I had an appointment. He didn't ask for details, but the look he gave me said he understood. When I arrived at Jessica's office, she was waiting with a folder on her desk. I followed Amanda on Tuesday night, she began, opening the folder to reveal a series of photographs. The first photo showed Amanda walking into the lobby of a luxury hotel downtown. She was wearing a sleek red dress, the kind she used to wear on date nights with me. The second photo showed Trevor entering the same hotel minutes later. He was easy to recognize from Amanda's descriptions. Tall, broad-shouldered, and obnoxiously confident in a tailored suit. The third photo was the one that hit me the hardest, Amanda and Trevor walking hand in hand through the lobby, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at the photos for a long time, my chest tightening. There's more, Jessica said, breaking the silence. She handed me a printout of an email exchange she'd managed to intercept. It was between Amanda and Trevor, discussing an upcoming trip to Cancun. Business conference, Amanda had written. Looking forward to it, Trevor replied, followed by a winking emoji. My grip on the paper tightened. Amanda had told me just last week that she was considering attending a retail expo in Denver. Cancun had never been mentioned. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the photos and emails spread out on the coffee table. My anger had hardened into something cold and sharp. I wasn't going to confront Amanda. Not yet. If I wanted to end this on my terms, I needed to think carefully. I opened my laptop and began researching. First, I found a nearby firearms dealer and made an appointment to buy a small pistol. I had never been a gun owner, but the thought of confronting Trevor without some form of protection made my skin crawl. Next, I revisited the security system Amanda had insisted we install last year. It was a high-end model with sensors on all the doors and windows, but I knew its weak points. I would bypass it, ensuring I could come and go unnoticed. By the time I closed my laptop, my plan was starting to take shape. The house was still and quiet as I moved through it. Every step deliberate, every sound carefully muted. The tools for my plan, a set of discreet wireless cameras I had picked up that afternoon, sat in a small black bag slung over my shoulder. Amanda was at the boutique, as usual, leaving me the perfect window to work undisturbed. The thought of what I was about to do sent a strange current of emotion through me. Part guilt, part grim determination. I wasn't the kind of man who pried into my wife's privacy. But this wasn't about privacy anymore. It was about truth. I started in the bedroom. The first camera was small, barely noticeable, with a wide-angle lens that would capture the entire room. I positioned it high on the bookshelf, blending it seamlessly among the spines of Amanda's favorite novels. A second camera went into the ensuite bathroom, hidden in the folds of the decorative towels Amanda never let anyone use. It wasn't enough to see the act. I wanted to hear everything. I installed tiny audio recorders alongside the cameras, careful to test each one before leaving the room. By the time I finished, The tension in my chest had settled into a cold, steady rhythm. Amanda came home an hour later, breezing through the door with her usual air of confidence. She set her handbag on the counter and gave me a distracted smile. "Hey, you're home early," she said. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "Figured I'd take it easy tonight." She nodded, her attention already shifting to her phone. "I'll be upstairs if you need me. Just go to change." I watched her ascend the staircase, her heels clicking against the hardwood. My jaw tightened as I imagined what she was changing into and who it might be for. The next day, I put the second part of my plan into motion. Over breakfast, I told Amanda I had a last-minute business trip coming up, a 3-day project site review in Michigan. Her reaction was neutral, almost too neutral, as if she were trying not to seem too pleased. "When are you leaving?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "Early flight." She nodded, glancing at her phone. "Well, safe travels. Let me know if you need me to pack anything for you." Her indifference was almost laughable. I left the house early the next morning, driving my truck to the airport parking lot as if I were catching a flight. But instead of boarding a plane, I took a cab back to a hotel downtown. From there, I accessed the hidden camera feed on my laptop, watching the live footage of the house. Most of the day passed uneventfully. Amanda went about her usual routine, leaving for the boutique and returning in the late afternoon. It wasn't until that night, just after 2 a.m., that everything changed. The feed from the bedroom camera showed Amanda entering the room, her movements hurried. She was wearing a silk robe I hadn't seen before, the kind of thing meant to be noticed. Moments later, Trevor appeared on the screen. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a leather jacket, his confidence as apparent as ever. They didn't waste any time. Trevor pulled Amanda into a kiss as soon as he stepped through the door, and she responded with a fervor that made my stomach turn. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Their conversation, muffled but audible through the audio recorder, made it even worse. "I can't believe we have the whole house to ourselves," Amanda said, her voice light and teasing. "Well, your husband's an idiot for trusting you," Trevor replied with a smirk. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. It wasn't just the betrayal that enraged me. It was their arrogance, their utter disregard for everything we had built together. I grabbed the pistol from my bag, its weight both foreign and reassuring in my hand. The drive home felt surreal, the city lights blurring as I sped through the streets. My mind was a storm of anger and clarity, the plan crystallizing with every passing mile. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was ready. The house was silent as I entered through the side door, bypassing the security system with the code I had altered earlier that week. The faint hum of voices drifted down from the bedroom, fueling my resolve. The bedroom door creaked as I pushed it open, and in an instant, the laughter I had heard just moments before vanished. The room was frozen in time. The scene before me burned into my memory like a brand. Trevor was on the bed, shirtless, his cocky demeanor stripped away as he turned to face me. Amanda stood in the doorway of the bathroom, her silk robe half open, her bare shoulder glinting in the soft light. For a moment, no one moved. "Samuel," Amanda gasped, clutching the robe tighter around herself. Her voice wavered, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I stepped into the room, the pistol heavy in my hand, but steady. "I think the better question, Amanda, is what are you doing here?" "With him." Trevor raised his hands, palms forward, as if surrendering could undo what he had done. "Hey man, let's talk about this. There's no need for violence." "No need for violence?" I said, my voice low and calm. "That's rich coming from the man in my bedroom, in my bed with my wife." Amanda took a shaky step forward, her wide eyes darting between me and the gun. "Samuel, please just listen to me. This isn't what it looks like." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Not what it looks like. So you weren't just laughing together in our bedroom? You weren't just in here, lying to my face for months, humiliating me while I trusted you." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Trevor, emboldened by Amanda's silence, took a step off the bed. "Look, man," he said, his voice slick with false confidence. "I get that you're upset, but let's be reasonable. Put the gun down, and we can work this out." I raised the pistol, pointing it directly at him. He froze mid-step, his hands shooting up again. "Work this out," I said, my voice cold. "Like you worked your way into my house? My wife? My life?" The tension in the room was electric. Every second stretched thin as a wire. Trevor's eyes darted toward the door. A calculated move I caught immediately. "Don't even think about it," I warned. "Samuel, please," Amanda said again, her voice breaking. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, her usual confidence and poise gone. Just put the gun down and we can talk about this." I shifted my gaze to her, the betrayal cutting deeper than I had thought possible. "Talk about what, Amanda? How you been sneaking around behind my back? How you let this parasite walk into our home, into our life?" "I made a mistake," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It didn't mean anything. Please, Samuel, you have to believe me." I shook my head, disgusted. "Didn't mean anything? You meant something when you invited him into this house, into my bed." Trevor took another step forward, slow and deliberate. "Look, man," he began, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his fear. "You don't want to do this. You don't want to ruin your life over a mistake." I fired a shot into the wall. The sound exploded through the room like a thunderclap, shaking the windows. Amanda screamed, stumbling backward into the bathroom doorframe. Trevor dropped to his knees, his hands still raised. "Ruin my life?" I said, my voice rising as the gun smoked in my hand. "You already ruined my life." Trevor scrambled to his feet, desperation taking over. Fine, I'll leave. I'll go. You'll never see me again." His tone was pleading now, his earlier arrogance gone. He took another step toward the door, and something in me snapped. "You're not walking out of here like nothing happened," I said, my voice like ice. Before I could react, Trevor lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate move, but it caught me off guard. His shoulder slammed into mine, and the gun wavered in my grip. For a moment, we struggled, his weight bearing down on me as we grappled. Then the shot rang out. Trevor collapsed, clutching his leg as blood began to soak through his jeans. A second shot fired almost instinctively, grazing his torso and sending him sprawling onto the floor, gasping in pain. Amanda's scream tore through the air, raw and guttural. She ran from the bathroom, her hands outstretched as if to shield Trevor. "Samuel, stop," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You've done enough. Done enough," I said, turning the gun toward her. "You've done this to yourself, Amanda." She froze, her hands trembling in the air. "Samuel, please don't. I'll do anything. Just don't do this." Her words sounded hollow, desperate. I felt the rage boiling over, and before I could stop myself, I pulled the trigger. The shot struck her shoulder, spinning her to the side. She crumpled to the floor, clutching the wound and crying out in pain. The room was silent except for their groans. Amanda cradling her shoulder and Trevor moaning on the floor, his leg bleeding onto the carpet. I stared at them for a long moment, the weight of the gun pressing against my palm. The rage that had fueled me moments ago began to wane, replaced by a cold clarity. I reached for the phone on the nightstand and dialed. "This is Samuel Hayes," I said, my voice steady. "There's been a home invasion. My wife has been injured, and the intruder has been neutralized. Send an ambulance." I hung up, setting the phone down beside the gun. The sirens would be here soon. The consequences would come later. But for now, I stood in the wreckage of what had once been my life, watching as the people who had betrayed me lay broken before me. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of my home like a distorted kaleidoscope. The sirens had grown louder as they approached, their sharp cries piercing through the oppressive silence that had settled over the room. Trevor was still on the floor, groaning, his hand clamped over the wound in his leg. Amanda huddled near the dresser, her face pale, one arm clutching her shoulder where the bullet had torn through. Blood pooled on the hardwood, and I stood there, unmoving, the pistol lying on the bed where I'd placed it after the call. I heard the officers before I saw them. Their boots pounded up the stairs, and the door burst open. "Hands where we can see them!" One of them barked, his gun trained on me. I raised my hand slowly, locking eyes with the officer. "The weapon's on the bed," I said evenly, my voice devoid of the fury that had gripped me moments ago. "On your knees," another officer ordered, stepping forward. I complied, lowering myself to the ground as I felt the cold press of handcuffs encircle my wrists. The ride to the station was a blur. They read me my rights, but I barely registered the words. My mind was stuck in a loop, replaying the events that had led to this moment. The anger, the betrayal, the shots, it all felt like a fever dream, surreal and distant. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, its fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. I sat alone at the metal table, my cuffed hands resting in front of me. My clothes were stained with blood, some mine from the scuffle, most of it theirs. The door opened, and a tall man with a hard expression walked in, a file tucked under his arm. "Detective Robert Haynes," he said, taking the seat across from me. "Do you know why you're here?" I stared at him for a moment before answering. "Because I defended my home." He opened the file, pulling out a stack of papers. "That's not what Amanda and Trevor are saying." "Of course it isn't," I said bitterly. Haynes leaned back in his chair, studying me. "According to their statements, you came home unannounced, barged into the bedroom, and started shooting." "They would say that," I replied. "They were caught in the act. What else were they going to tell you? And you just happened to have a gun?" "I bought it after I suspected something was going on," I admitted. "For protection." Haynes raised an eyebrow. "Protection from what? Your wife?" "Hello." "From the man in my house, in my bed," I said, my voice steady. I had no idea who he was or what he was capable of. For all I knew, he was a threat. Haynes tapped his pen against the table, his expression unreadable. "You're not making this easy for yourself, Samuel. Right now, it looks like a clear-cut case of jealous rage." I was placed in a holding cell that night, the cold metal bench beneath me offering no comfort. The next morning, I was informed that I was being charged with attempted murder. It didn't matter that I had called 911 or that I had told the officers everything. Amanda and Trevor had already spun their narrative. A jealous husband with a gun, fueled by anger and betrayal. My attorney, Claire, arrived later that day. Claire was sharp, with a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately filled the room. She set her briefcase on the table in the small conference room, where we were meeting, and sat across from me. "You're in deep trouble, Samuel," she began, flipping open the case file. "Attempted murder charges aren't easy to fight, especially with 2 witnesses against you." "They're lying," I said firmly. She raised an eyebrow. "Of course they are, but proving that is another matter. I need to know everything, every detail. Start from the beginning." I recounted the events leading up to the confrontation, sparing no detail. The late nights, the dinner receipt, the whispers of Trevor's name. The cameras, the recordings, the moment I walked into that room. When I finished, Claire leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You said you installed cameras," she said. "Do you still have the footage?" "It's on my laptop," I said. "At the house." Claire nodded. "I'll get a warrant to retrieve it. If what you're saying checks out, it could be a game changer." A week later, Claire returned with the evidence. The footage showed everything. Amanda and Trevor entering the bedroom, their laughter, their intimate exchanges. It captured Trevor's attempt to attack me, the struggle, and the moment I fired the shots. But that wasn't all Claire had found. "Samuel," she said, placing a stack of financial documents on the table in front of me. "Did you know Amanda has been draining your joint accounts?" "What?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "She's been transferring funds to a private account," Claire explained. "And Trevor has been receiving payments. It looks like they've been using your money to fund their little activities." The discovery turned the case on its head. Claire wasted no time presenting the evidence to the court, painting Amanda and Trevor as the true villains of the story. She argued that my actions were not out of jealousy, but out of fear for my safety and the sanctity of my home. The media, however, wasn't as kind. The headlines were ruthless: "Scorned husband snaps," "Jealousy turns violent," "Affair ends in gunfire." Every photo they used of me seemed to make me look unhinged, while Amanda and Trevor were painted as victims. But Claire remained steadfast. "We're going to turn this around," she assured me. "They think they've won, but they don't know what we've found. Trust me, Samuel. This is far from over. The courthouse loomed ahead of me, its tall columns and stone facade imposing against the gray Chicago sky. The weight of what lay inside bore down on me with every step I took. My hands, though free of cuffs, felt heavy at my sides as Claire walked beside me, a stack of legal pads and files tucked under her arm. She glanced at me, her expression calm but sharp. "Stay composed, Samuel. This is going to be a fight, but we're ready. Don't let their arguments rattle you. They'll do everything they can to make you lose your cool." "I understand," I said, though my voice sounded distant, even to myself. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras flashing as I passed. They hurled questions I didn't answer, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. Claire ushered me through the double doors into the courtroom, where a mix of spectators, journalists, and familiar faces filled the seats. Amanda sat on the other side of the room, dressed demurely in a pale blouse, her arm in a sling. She looked every bit the wrong party, her expression carefully composed. Trevor was next to her, his leg in a brace, his face a mask of discomfort. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the jury box. 12 faces, neutral for now, but I knew they would soon become the most important people in my life. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Eric, began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, pacing the floor with an air of practiced confidence, "this case is about control, about a man who couldn't handle losing it. Samuel Hayes is a man who allowed jealousy and rage to consume him. He didn't walk into that bedroom in self-defense. He went there with a plan to confront, to humiliate, and ultimately to harm." He gestured toward me, his voice steady and deliberate. "The evidence will show that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. Mr. Hayes bypassed his own alarm system, armed himself with a loaded weapon, and drove home with the intent to confront his wife and her companion. This wasn't self-defense. It was premeditation." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still as his words hung in the air. When it was Claire's turn, she rose with a calm, measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "this case isn't about control. It's about betrayal. It's about the lengths some people will go to deceive and exploit those who trust them the most." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the jury box. Samuel Hayes walked into that bedroom, not knowing what he would find. He didn't go there with a plan to harm anyone. He went there to uncover the truth. And what he found, his wife, Amanda, and her lover, Trevor, was not only a betrayal of his trust, but a violation of his home. Claire paused, letting her words sink in. But this case goes beyond infidelity. Amanda and Trevor weren't just deceiving Samuel emotionally. They were exploiting him financially, siphoning money from his accounts to fund their affair. The evidence will show who the real villains in this story are. The trial began in earnest with Amanda's testimony. She sat in the witness box, her sling visible to everyone in the courtroom. Her voice was soft, her tone measured, as she recounted the events of that night. "Samuel had been distant for weeks," she said, glancing at the jury. "I didn't know how to reach him anymore. When he came home that night, he looked different, angry. I was scared." Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the table in front of us. She didn't interrupt, didn't react. Amanda continued, her voice trembling. "He burst into the room and started yelling. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Then he pulled out the gun." She paused for effect, glancing at the jurors again. "I thought he was going to destroy us." When it was Claire's turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness box with a calm but pointed demeanor. "Amanda," she began, her voice steady, "you said you thought Samuel was going to destroy you. Did he ever explicitly threaten to do so?" Amanda hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "No, but he had a gun." Claire cut her off gently but firmly. "Yes or no, Amanda? Did he threaten to destroy you?" "No," Amanda admitted, her voice barely audible. "Did you ever tell him about your relationship with Trevor before that night?" Claire asked. "No," Amanda said, her tone defensive. Claire nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "And why is that?" Amanda glanced toward Trevor, then back at Claire. I don't want to hurt him. Trevor's testimony was next. He painted himself as a victim, a man caught in the crossfire of a marital dispute. I was just there to talk, he said, his voice smooth but lacking sincerity. Amanda was upset, and I was trying to comfort her. I had no idea Samuel would show up like that. Claire, however, was ready. Trevor, she said, holding up a stack of documents. These are bank records showing payments made to your account from Amanda's joint account with Samuel. Care to explain why she was transferring you thousands of dollars? Trevor's composure faltered. She was helping me with a business deal. Claire raised an eyebrow. A business deal? Is that what you call spending weekends in luxury hotels and planning a trip to Cancun? The turning point came when Claire called a surprise witness to the stand. A woman named Hannah, one of Trevor's former lovers, testified about his manipulative behavior. He used me, Hannah said, her voice shaking. He lied about everything, his job, his marriage, his intentions. And when I tried to leave, he threatened to ruin me. Her testimony was damning, painting Trevor as a serial manipulator. By the end of the trial, the jury's faces were no longer neutral. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with skepticism, but none looked at Amanda or Trevor the way they had at the beginning. The weight of everything hung heavy in the air as we awaited their verdict. The courtroom was silent. Not the comfortable silence of a room at peace, but the heavy, oppressive kind that seems to buzz just below the surface, weighing down on everyone inside. I sat at the defense table, my palms pressed flat against the polished wood. Claire was next to me, her face impassive, her sharp gaze fixed on the jury foreman. Amanda and Trevor sat across the aisle, their carefully curated expressions a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. "All rise," the bailiff said, his voice cutting through the tension. The judge entered, her robes flowing as she settled into her seat. The jury had reached a verdict, and the words we were about to hear would shape the rest of my life. The foreman stood, a middle-aged man with glasses and a somber expression. He held a sheet of paper in his hands, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. "In the matter of the state versus Samuel Hayes," he began, his voice steady, "on the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hit me like a breath of fresh air, a rush of relief that made my head swim. But it wasn't over yet. "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon," he continued, "we find the defendant guilty." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. I felt my stomach tighten, the reality of what that meant sinking in. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Foreman. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are dismissed." As the jury filed out, the judge turned her attention to me. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice firm but not unkind, "this court recognizes that your actions were the result of extreme provocation. However, the use of a firearm in a domestic setting cannot be excused, regardless of the circumstances. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years of probation with credit for time served. You will also be required to attend anger management counseling and perform 200 hours of community service. Do you understand these terms?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of her words. She gave a single nod. Court is adjourned. The room erupted into a flurry of noise as people began to rise from their seats. Claire leaned over, placing a hand on my arm. "It's not perfect, but it's a win," she said quietly. "You're not going to prison, Samuel. That's what matters." I nodded, though the relief was tempered by the sting of the verdict. 5 years of probation. A record. It wasn't what I had hoped for, but it was better than the alternative. Outside the courthouse, the reporters swarmed. Their cameras flashed, their questions flying at me from all directions. "Samuel, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think justice was served? Do you have any regrets about what you did?" I ignored them, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Claire shielded me as best she could, her sharp tone cutting through the chaos. "No comment," she said firmly. Once we were clear of the crowd, I turned to her. "Thank you, Claire, for everything." She smiled faintly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just don't let me catch you in another courtroom, Samuel." The fallout from the trial was swift and brutal. Trevor's reputation was shattered. The financial fraud, the affair, and the testimony from his former lover painted a damning picture that couldn't be ignored. His wife, Catherine, filed for divorce within days of the verdict, her lawyers making quick work of dividing their assets. Amanda didn't fare much better. Her boutique, once a thriving business, became the subject of gossip and scandal. Customers stopped coming, suppliers cut ties, and within weeks, she was forced to close the doors for good. I heard all of this through the grapevine, friends, former neighbors, even snippets from the news. I didn't reach out to her, and she didn't reach out to me. Whatever bond we had once shared was irreparably broken. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, their jagged peaks dusted with snow that glittered under the late morning sun. The cabin, nestled at the edge of a forest, was simple but sturdy, its wooden walls radiating a rustic charm that had drawn me to it in the first place. The crisp Colorado air filled my lungs as I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and leaned against the porch railing. This place, with its silence and solitude, was the kind of refuge I had never known I needed. It had been 6 months since I left Chicago. The proceeds from the sale of the house had been enough to buy this property outright, with a little left over to live modestly while I figured out my next steps. Each day here felt like a small act of rebuilding, of reclaiming myself. The scars of what I had been through were still there, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of my life. The sound of tires crunching over gravel pulled me from my thoughts. A car, an older sedan that had seen better days, came into view. My chest tightened as the door opened, and Amanda stepped out. She looked different from the last time I had seen her. The polished exterior she had maintained throughout the trial was gone, replaced by a raw, disheveled appearance. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. "Samuel," she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. I stayed where I was, letting the coffee cup dangle loosely from my fingers. She hesitated at the edge of the driveway, as if waiting for an invitation that would never come. Finally, she took a tentative step forward, then another until she was standing at the base of the porch. "What are you doing here, Amanda?" I asked, my voice steady. Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or desperation. "I needed to see you." "You've seen me," I said. "Now you can leave." "Please, Samuel," she said, her voice breaking. "Just hear me out." I set the coffee down on the railing and crossed my arms. "You've got 2 minutes." She swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I lost everything, Samuel. The boutique, Trevor, everything's gone. And I've had so much time to think about what I did, about how I hurt you. I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. She took a shaky breath, her eyes pleading. "I'm sorry, Samuel. For all of it. For lying to you. For betraying you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you. Please." Her words might have moved me once. There was a time when I would have done anything to fix what was broken between us. But that time was long gone. I shook my head slowly. "You don't need me, Amanda. You need someone to clean up the mess you made of your life. I'm not that person anymore." She blinked, as if the words had physically struck her. "I've changed," she said weakly. "I can be better. For you. For us." "There is no us," I said, my tone firm. "Not anymore. I spent years giving you everything I had, and you threw it all away. You didn't care about me then, Amanda. You only care now because you have nothing left." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt nothing as I watched them fall. "You're right," she whispered. "I don't deserve another chance." But I didn't know where else to go. I sighed, the weariness of it all settling in my bones. "Then go anywhere but here." She lingered for a moment longer, her shoulders slumping as she turned and walked back to the car. I watched her go, the weight of the past finally lifting as her taillights disappeared down the winding road. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the mountains wrapping around me like a blanket. Later that day, I joined my hiking group at the trailhead a few miles from the cabin. It was a small group, just 5 of us, but it had become one of the highlights of my new life. As we set off into the woods, Emily fell into step beside me. She was kind-hearted and sharp, with a wit that often left me smiling despite myself. "How's the cabin coming along?" she asked, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "Slowly," I said, my tone lighter than it had been in months. "But it's starting to feel like home." She smiled, her gaze lingering on me for a moment before turning back to the trail ahead. This was my life now, and it was mine to rebuild. Bye-bye.